So thank you so much for coming. That's amazing. I just watched the documentary and your TED talk, and I ordered the books. So we probably should read them in Museum of Care. Yeah, you kind of going through the same path as David, Rojava and Spain. His father was fighting in the civil war in Spain as a young American. Just went there.
Yeah.
And he also saw in Spain his father saw the movie about Stalin that was brought by Soviets, and he was like, "Oh, okay, I didn't sign up to for the orders of this guy in the white suit," and so he's so amazing.
And well, it's very inspiring journey. I mean, it's the Spanish Civil War is very inspiring. It's the only really living example of anarchism up until Rojava.
Oh, Zapatistas maybe too. Huh?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, they come into Europe this summer.
Are they?
170 of them. Yeah, this is really a cool story because because the Mexican government asks Spain and Pope to tell sorry for the colonial genocide, and they refused. And so Zapatistas was saying like, okay, guys, Spanish people, we don't want you to tell sorry, and we're not coming to conquer you back. This is 170 women who's coming mostly. But we want to talk because, we are all in that together. So we're not talking about something that happened 150 years ago. We're talking about what's going on right now. And we're attacked right now. So that would be the sum of Zapatistas in Europe.
Oh, that's exciting. I look forward to hearing more about that.
Yeah. So, but maybe we can start asking you questions about decision-making process, and this will be a little controversial, probably for you, because I hear your talks where you're like talking about how it's very possible to make decision collectively on any site and scope. And we had a crisis in our project some times ago. That's how this project was born, because we were trying to make decisions together, and we created a core group for that, because the idea was that we are online community, very open. We like about 450 people now, but occasionally come and go. Everybody do whatever they want. There is no restriction. But idea was we're creating a core group in which we will put together an infrastructure, like a website and PR campaign or whatever else we need. And we will fundraise for that and to pay the people who's working there. And then it didn't work out very well because we just kind of, to my understanding, but it's still in the process. It's not done. Yeah. To my understanding, it's always about creating a groups. Who are we and who are they? And it's possible when you do something together on the land, like Rojava people or Zapatistas, and it's more difficult when you do it, without any solid, concrete projects that very well defined with the affinity group. That could be done with the affinity group. And so you are like for us an example, amazing example to ask us questions, because you're working in diplomacy that is definitely this territory where you kind of come from somewhere else to the other land, and you're negotiating between this more or less abstract entities, to my understanding. So maybe you can, so that would be my question. I don't know what Simona and Mikhail would ask.
Well,
sure. Well, I'm happy
it sounds like
try to answer anything.
this, see if I've got this sort of documentary format of going out and interviewing people about how decision-making came out of the sort of discussions about, well, how do we make decisions? Let's go ask other people how they make decisions.
Yeah.
It's an excellent opportunity to go out and talk about all the different ways in which, because you've been involved in places like the Foreign Service, how do they make decisions when you were there? You've been involved in, excuse me, lots of other stuff since then, and seen lots of different types of decision making. So to see that, hear a bit about the arc of being involved in different decision making processes. Like if you work for a government, how do governments make decisions?
Sure.
I may have plenty of questions, but later. So please go ahead with the discussion.
Okay. So I don't know, maybe we should start from the question of distinction between the people who is in a way forced to make decision together because, for example, they're sharing land or water, or like, you know, they have to fight together against others. So they must decide. And the people who is, let's say in Zuccotti Park, and they all kind of come in and go. Somebody came and make a lecture, and then some people stay overnight, and some people left the next day. So that's a different setup and environment. So maybe you can just share your ideas about how would the direct democracy working in these different settings.
I think the big thing I have learned is that direct democracy is a process. It's a culture. It's an ecology. It's not so much a decision to make choices and decision making in a particular way, because in a sense that's the easy bit, just to say we're going to have fully participatory and equal decision making. What's much harder is creating a culture where that is feasible, because when you have lots of people who are used to hierarchical decision making, and he who shouts loudest gets their way, it is very difficult to institute equal decision making, participatory decision making in that circumstance. And we certainly saw that in Zuccotti Park, which I attended many times because I was living in New York at the time, and in the working groups associated with Occupy Wall Street. It was very difficult to shake the habits and the cultural habits of hierarchy. And I think what I became convinced about was that genuinely participatory decision-making can only flourish in a system where it is broadly understood culturally by people, and where there is an ecology of decision-making on those terms surrounding any particular forum, so that in a sense it's mutually reinforcing.
Yes, that's right. But it's also interesting that most of the direct democracy projects throughout the history, to my knowledge, coming out of crisis. So actually when people are well,
Yes.
they keep their existing structures, but when something happens, you know, like financial crisis or military crisis or, you know, hurricane, so then people started to collaborate and naturally, you know, help each other and created this like, horizontal connections.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And Rebecca Solnit has made the same observation about how people behave in disaster, that people tend to collaborate more spontaneously on a horizontal level. And certainly the two major examples that we see of anarchist organizing, of social organizing without government, in particular the Spanish Civil War and the case of Rojava in northeast Syria, both came about in situations of crisis where the existing government was essentially erased and there was a kind of tabula rasa where new structures could grow up. But in both cases, there was a very strong cultural understanding particularly amongst leading figures, but also socially important figures, of how horizontal decision-making should be practiced, because there are techniques, there's a sort of technical aspect to it about how it should be practiced. It doesn't just arise spontaneously necessarily, although Rebecca Solnit observed that people do collaborate and cooperate in situations of disaster much more easily than they do when there are existing hierarchies. As you say, existing hierarchies tend to fix people into certain habits of decision making, and they're very difficult to break out of. It's very difficult to break up existing hierarchies because power is entrenched in those hierarchies and people are very reluctant to let go of whatever power they have.
I have more questions, but maybe I should allow Michael to ask his, and you answer to his question.
Well, maybe to follow on with that, I'm not sure how much you're familiar with the, so the period of the 1990s saw, and the lead up to the 1990s saw neoliberalism applied to both what Yugoslavia, the sort of former Yugoslavia, and to the Zapatista, to the Chiapas region of Mexico, and there were sort of very different results. One, you had a war where obviously there was actually the sort of word ethnic cleansing kind of sort of came out of that as the sort of infamous word that came out of diplomatic discussions. Whereas in the Chiapas region, you had a group of people who had worked to sort of build some type of decision making and community there, and developed a they also had a military situation that was very brief, and they moved towards like sort of a standoff with negotiations or diplomacy. So I'm not sure if that's really a question, but maybe and whether that's really your area of expertise, but like sort of what happens when these kind of situations in countries that degenerate into wars.
I don't know about Chiapas or Mexico. I do know a little bit about former Yugoslavia. I worked in former Yugoslavia for a while for the United Nations. I mean, there, what happened was that a situation of chaos and a breakup of the existing communist state system was exploited by the government in Belgrade. Existing ethnic tensions were exacerbated by the behavior of the government in Belgrade, which used the crisis as an opportunity to foment ethnic cleansing and to build a state, a Serbian sectarian-based state, both in Serbia itself, of course, and in Bosnia. So, you know, there was no existing culture of bottom-up decision-making that could stood any chance of flourishing in that circumstance. I mean, it was a communist state. It was a deeply hierarchical, top-down, state-based organization. And I think there was very little chance of a bottom-up system emerging out of that crisis.
If I may comment, I think economically, former Yugoslavia was actually only one example of a socialist state where they're all major factories controlled by the workers from bottom up. And my personal take on that, talking to the people who from former Yugoslavia, is just this country collapsed intentionally by Germany mostly, was kind of taken apart, because that was one of the alternative models, economic models that was working ideologically, and plus it was a competitive, first competitive country for the West, and also where the monetary foundation first started to work and gave loans to them. So that's all coincide with like financial crisis. So of course, the state has a lot to do with that, but not only Yugoslavian state itself, but also European countries. And yeah, and then it's interesting to see how like Zapatistas, for example, they close themselves in a way and they separate it. They say, okay, this is our languages. We don't even understand Spanish mostly, and this is the rest of the world. And they always, sometimes close access of the foreigners to their communities. And everybody who integrated to this bigger world looks like could be affected by these powers. So
sure. Well, I don't share that assessment of how the war in Yugoslavia came about and how the breakup of Yugoslavia happened. I think Germany's actions may have exacerbated the breakup of Yugoslavia at certain points, in particular the early recognition of Croatia, the premature recognition of Croatia. But I don't think Germany deliberately engineered the collapse of the state because it was an alternative economic model that was a plausible competition for the German capitalist model. And I don't think many people who lived in Yugoslavia would accept that there was a genuine bottom-up democratic way of running the economy. I mean, there was a stifling bureaucracy that commanded everything, where permissions were, you had to get permission to do everything. It was a deeply corrupt bureaucracy. I mean, if you talk to people who actually lived in it, they don't have any they don't have a great deal positive to say about it.
Okay, that's probably for different conversation. Yeah, because now like everything is owned by Germans there, and the bureaucracy is still there, and it's corrupt by the
this is all true. I don't know. I'm not saying it's turned out particularly well. I mean, it has in certain parts of former Yugoslavia. Slovenia has turned out relatively well, but other parts of former Yugoslavia have not turned out particularly well. I agree.
Yeah.
How about saying, so maybe a little bit about how governments make decisions and how do diplomats make decisions? You've got experience in the Foreign Service, and in terms of how they interact with with the government, what that process is, and how do diplomats between one country and another country make decisions between them, and how do they then interact with their governments? Because I'm presuming there's always, if you're a diplomat on the ground, there's always an authority structure to kind of go back to, or maybe people who are diplomat at the level actually makes the decision. So that's sort of how do governments make decisions, how do diplomats make decisions amongst themselves, how do diplomats between two countries make decisions, and how they both relate to the government. And maybe the question after that would be, how do diplomats make decisions when they're upset about their government? Because you are obviously involved with some other diplomats who felt that some of the government wasn't on the line. But let's leave that one just as a more personal story, but maybe the basics of how those decisions are made.
Sure. Well, let me try to do that briefly. I mean, in my experience in foreign policy, in diplomacy, make decisions in an extremely structured, hierarchical manner, where bureaucrats and officials try to second guess the preferences of the political authorities, the ministers, the foreign minister, but also the prime minister in the case of Britain. Decisions are made in a profoundly hierarchical way, where choices may be formulated by the most junior officials, but they are passed up through a structural system and approved at different layers of the hierarchy. I mean, it's not a participatory system. It's not equalitarian. It doesn't necessarily decisions, but it does produce efficient decisions. It's a highly efficient, honed, well-oiled system.
Can you talk about how they deal with knowledge in that system? Because one of the things that many of us experience.
Sorry, how they deal with what? You broke up.
With knowledge, like who knows what's going on? Because one of the things many people deal with is the people who are doing the work know what's going on, and the people who are, in some sense, at the top of a hierarchy don't always know what's going on.
Yeah.
And
Well,
so
I agree
bad
with
decisions or good decisions based on
Yeah.
to what extent people listen to the knowledge, or to what extent people can adapt the desires to knowledge on the ground.
Well, I've argued in books and elsewhere that the whole system of diplomacy is considerably divorced from reality and deals with symbols and shapes and terminologies about reality which do not necessarily reflect reality. But even within those systems, knowledge may be held at the junior level, but it's not necessarily shared at the senior level. Nevertheless, those systems, the participants in those systems believe that wisdom is sequestered at the top of the system, and that those people at the top of the decision-making tree are able to make competent, rational decisions on the basis of information that is filtered up to them. But almost by definition, in a pyramid-based decision-making system, knowledge is reduced as it goes up through the tree of decision-making, and there's less and less awareness of the reality at the bottom of the pyramid, at the top of the pyramid. So you can see that those systems are inherently weak in terms of making knowledge-based decisions. And that's certainly what I observed. You know, that the more you went up the tree, the more prejudice and bias and existing political decisions formed the decisions and determined the decision making, rather than actual knowledge of the complex reality that was supposedly at stake. As for how decisions are made between countries, that's a very different matter. I mean, I served at the UN Security Council, where there is a very particular protocol and structure of decision making, where if certain countries agree on the outcome, they can actually agree formal decisions, legal decisions in the form of Security Council resolutions or statements. If there is consensus within the Security Council and there are no vetoes of the permanent members, that is a specific form of decision making. That is, there are different forms of decision making at the EU, at the WTO, the Human Rights Council, etc., etc. Each has its own different rules and structures of decision making. And then there's the more informal decision making between countries at a bilateral level, where they are not subject to a specific set of rules, but they are trying to make decisions between them, for instance, to agree a bilateral treaty. And in those cases, you know, there are particular habits and protocols of the diplomatic world that tend to be observed, not always observed, but tend to be observed in how decisions are reached. Again, it's quite structured. You know, governments have particular ways of behaving towards one another in the diplomatic realm, which are quite well established. Again, it's not necessarily, it doesn't produce justice, it doesn't necessarily produce competence or rationality, but it is efficient relatively. You know, there is a very well established diplomatic system where decisions and subjects are discussed between countries in a pretty rich and sophisticated manner. I don't think it's a democratic system. It's not transparent. It doesn't necessarily produce good decisions, but it is well established. And in some circumstances, it's relatively smooth. This is a very, very brief overview. I mean, we can go into more detail about any particular aspect of it, for example, at the UN or the, you know, other international bodies. I happen to know the UN better than others.
If I can have a follow-up question, I would like to ask about what do you think about this dual power? Like when, you know, some direct democracy exists in the local level, like in Rojava, but they still have the special people who is communicating with outside, and the way how the decision made in these two bodies are different. And if we talk about Zapatistas, then they have this very specifically inefficient method of the delegates who cannot decide anything and who have to come back, and all these 30 languages should be translated. And that's probably how, it's my guess, they build in this very necessary protection territory between them and the others, you know, that allow them to be
Mm-hmm.
who they are. But of course, we have globalized world. For example, imagine we have direct democracy everywhere. We still will need all these different entities will need to communicate with each other somehow.
Yes. Yes.
And you have this
Yes.
experience. So how would you? What would be your idea? How would it work?
I think it's quite feasible. I mean, I think it's often one of the criticisms of these systems that's advanced is how would states deal with each other if they were directly democratic. But as long as delegates are accountable, fully accountable to the local decisions that are made by the local decision makers, and they are recallable. In other words, there is true accountability that the local assembly has power over the delegate, then it's perfectly feasible that a delegate or a representative could speak for the local entity in an international forum. Or, I mean, the Democratic Council achieves this. The representatives of the Syrian Democratic Council are accountable to the local assemblies in Rojava. I mean, it's difficult to say that this is a perfect system. I think there's more empirical investigation needed of what has happened in Rojava before people should necessarily celebrate it as a paradigm of this kind of direct democratic system. But it is perfectly plausible to have a local direct democracy with representatives who are interacting with other entities, you know, such as states, who are, as long as they are fully accountable, and that they are only representing decisions made by the local assembly.
But the overall system, imagine we have all the voters contain of Rojavas and Zapatistas. So, but still the council or United Nations, what kind of rules would you write for them? Would you leave whatever is now? Would you rewrite it?
Ha! Wow, that's a big question. I think it would be so different culturally from what we see today in the state-based system that I think different rules would inevitably emerge in an international system. The United Nations is a very imperfect decision-making body. Power is concentrated in a few countries, in particular the veto-holding permanent members of the UN Security Council. They are by far the most powerful countries in the UN system. And therefore, there are grotesque power imbalances inherent in the way the UN is organized. And I don't think you want to replicate that. You'd want a much more equal system where small states and big states had an equal voice, and where, to the degree possible, you made decisions by consensus. I am one of the ironies.
Can you say a little bit about resources in that case? Because we see this when we build local coalitions of activists and trade unions and things like that. And as everybody's at the table and we're all making these decisions, but some people have got money and resources and can make the thing happen, and other people have got people and action and can make the thing happen. And some people are there without those things, but they will contribute. What happens when you try to organize states and some have money and some don't? I mean, the reason.
Well, it's called a power imbalance. It's not complicated. I mean, it's a you know, you get power imbalances in the state system, and you know, where some entities and some actors have resources and others don't. It's very difficult to overcome that and produce truly equal decision making. It's extremely difficult to overcome that. You know, I think building a truly horizontal decision-making structure at the international level is extremely challenging. All I can say is that those entities that practice that kind of decision-making at the domestic level should cooperate with each other as much as possible to form coalitions to take on the powerful. Is the only plausible way forward.
That's a little bit how during the Cold War was this coalition of, how you call it in English, non-aligned countries. Yeah. So it's
Yes,
probably
the
was
non-aligned movement, yes.
yeah, that is probably the model for what's supposed to happens now. I don't know if anything like that going on in international politics.
There is some remnants still of the non-aligned movement. There's still a non-aligned movement grouping at the United Nations, remarkably, despite the fact that the Cold War has long since ended. And there's still some sense of that amongst certain countries, that, you know, there are countries that believe that they stand up for something other than the US-based order, or increasingly the Chinese-based order. I mean, I think what we'll see is these two poles of attraction will become defining organizational models for the UN international system. You know, different and competing areas of influence. In a sense, a new Cold War. I think it will be more complicated than the Cold War was, because the trade relations and the economic relations between China and the rest of the world are much more dense than they ever were between the Soviet Union and the Soviet system, the Warsaw Pact countries, and their economic relations with the rest of the world.
I just want to quickly, before Anka this was your turn, but I want to just introduce Simona to this conversation. So to follow up with the question, because Simona is working with GEM25, and we were talking with her how, despite everybody is separated in the world, like now it's so many movements who is trying to create something that is the decent national state. And GEM25 was one of this attempt. And yeah, so it's very interesting how that could actually happen. And because it looks like we all have to help somehow these movements as strong as we can. That's our hope.
Oh, well, how to say, the problem is we started this an endeavor that is GEM25 that is to have a movement of people from all over Europe and all over the world speaking many different languages and yet having one goal. Brian Eno, at the very foundation of this movement, said, let's start cooking and the recipe will come. I think only an Englishman could say something like this. But the idea was it's highly experimental, so let's try and adjust in the move.
The Zapatistas have a phrase about walking and talking at the same time.
Yeah, el camino se hace al caminar. The path becomes clear during the walk. It's something very similar. As a matter of fact, the result, until now at least, is a highly centralized and bureaucratical organization. So I cannot say we succeeded in having a movement that is at the same time grassroots and international. We are still trying. There are many attempts inside the organization to make this like this. We have groups that study decisional methods, but I wouldn't take GEM25 as an example of success on this from this point of view. And actually, I would ask suggestion on how to deal with it. And I had actually a question for Carne. Is it possible to make something like the Zapatistas or Rojava without closing borders in a way? because is it possible to make anarchism not just in one country?
That's a good question. Of course, it's possible. I mean, I think we will see it emerge. I'm very optimistic about the future of bottom-up decision making and organization, because I see a crisis in the traditional system of representative democracy and capitalism, where people feel increasingly disillusioned by these systems and are looking for alternatives. And I sense that there's more interest in anarchistic bottom-up models than there has been before. There's less complacency about Western democracy. So I'm optimistic. But how it will happen, I don't think anybody can necessarily predict, because it has to emerge organically. I mean, I think that our role is to spread the idea and to spread the knowledge of available systems, to speak the gospel, if you like, to spread the gospel systems and to explain why they work and why they're better than existing. But it's up to other people to establish them. They've got to be appropriate for their own contexts. They've got to you know, this was what happened in Rojava. The Rojava system of democracy emerged from different threads of culture and politics amongst the Kurdish people, in the PKK in particular, but also more broadly in Kurdish society, and thus is more stable and more connected to the people. You can't impose these systems, and I don't think I have a model of revolution in my mind of how this change should come about, and I would be resistant to anyone suggesting there were such a model.
I have a question, maybe that it's linked to Simona's question. What are the conditions for things to happen? But there is this wonderful story by Ursula Le Guin about, it's called The Ones Who Left Omelas, where there is this utopian society, everyone's feeling happy, and their happiness depends on this child being held in the dark and not fed, and his misery. And people start to leave this is one of the actions, and you could see it as, you know, they are cowards, not acting, or maybe they don't want to be, you know, complicit, and that's an action itself. It's not passive. And I guess my question is, what are the conditions for more people like you to leave these powers of these structures? Why did you leave? What is the point? How can we bring maybe more people at that in that moment of crisis or something that yeah.
Well, I can only speak from my own example, was that it required a crisis for me to leave, and that crisis was called the Iraq War. And lie told by my government forced me to make a choice as to whether to stay and collaborate with that lie or to leave and do something else. And I felt that my conscience demanded that I leave. This was a very unusual circumstance. It was an unusual crisis. And had it not happened, I'd probably still be a diplomat to this day. Not a very happy one, because there were deeper contradictions in my life serving the system that I was serving. And I didn't feel I had real autonomy or agency in that system, which is fundamentally undermining. But I do think, you know, crisis was what was necessary. And I do think we see these waves of crises more broadly, whether it's the financial crisis, where people begin to question the status quo because they see it failing in its fundamental duty to protect people and to sustain their flourishing. And when people see that system fail, then they begin to look for other alternatives. I don't think you convince people intellectually. I think
but
they
is
have to
there
see the evidence in front of them.
Is there a structure, for example, for people to not be, you know, to leave and to be caught through some kind of net, or like at independent diplomat? Do you know people who are leaving, and can they come to you, for example, and join your forces? Or can they go to
No, I mean,
DM25?
such a net doesn't exist. I wish it did. I'm aware of organizations which are trying to set up support systems for whistleblowers more generally, to support them when they have to quit or are fired. That would be great if there was more established systems to look after people who are dissidents from the system. That certainly would have helped me. But that doesn't currently exist, and independent diplomat is certainly not that.
And in terms of the break that you had on the theme of decision making, what kinds of places were there decisions that were made that made you break out? And did you make decisions with other people, or have agreements with other people that were broken, or understandings with your employers that then turned out to not be true? Is there a moment where this sort of the hierarchical decision making that you've described, and that you've described as very efficient for doing what it does in terms of creating kind of big international decisions, that broke for you and other people? Because there's obviously all kinds of people who are upset within that. I'm sure you're not really at liberty to speak about all of those things and what particular people said, but so we're not really necessarily asking that, but just the issue of what is it amongst a group of people who think, wow, I mean, at some level it must be very, how different or similar is it to the discussion that the point you said, oh, my employers, my bosses, the government doesn't actually have the knowledge to do what's going on. So they don't really know what's going on, but I have to help them make a decision. And then this is slightly different, that you're always in attention because the government doesn't know what's going on, whereas the people doing the diplomacy might have a frontline experience and knowledge. Well, this is a slightly different thing. There's a tension between you actually know and don't want to see something happening. This is like,
yeah. Well, I've written extensively about what happened, including in my evidence to the Butler and Chilcot inquiry. But in essence, I represented British policy on Iraq and weapons of mass destruction for several years at the UN Security Council. And we made a particular claim about Iraq's threat, which the government then later directly contradicted without any evidence for the change. We said that Iraq was not a threat. We believe that Iraq was not a threat, but it could become a threat, and that there were various questions about its WMD stocks, particularly of chemical weapons, biological weapons, and missiles, which needed to be answered. The government, in the run-up to the 2003 war, claimed instead that they had specific knowledge of Iraq's holdings of weapons of mass destruction, of its missiles, of its chemical weapons, etc., which made Iraq a threat. And I knew that the evidence base had not changed, and yet the government was saying something completely different. That is a lie. The government was misrepresenting what it knew to the people and to the soldiers it was sending off to war, and that was very clear to me, and that forced me to make a choice about whether I could go along with it or not. So it was very, very specific to the circumstance of the Iraq war.
I would like to follow up on Anka's question and ask about the structures, because for me, it's clear that Rojava and Zapatistas in both cases were able to happen because they did have the structures, they prepare them, you know. Zapatistas they had them before for a long time. So in our situation, the structures, the only thing I can see personally is because we're living in the industrial civilization. Most of the people in our part of the world living in cities. So I only see this network of rebellion cities or democratic cities, and we have the people from that network talking to us. One of them is actually Debbie Bookchin, who is also very active supporter of Rojava, but that's experience and the structures that seems more relevant for me, to the world that we inhabited, because we cannot become, peasants like Zapatistas and go to these assemblies where we will decide everyday routine. So I'm living in a city, I'm foreigner, I don't know any of my neighbors. So for me, it will be a very different life process to start to be immersed with the others. And so I think these democratic cities may provide that, but I never tried it. So it's a big question.
Mm-hmm.
So what is it for you? Would be?
Well, the two things to say really. One is that habits of collaboration and cooperation, as Rebecca Solnit has observed, but also others, exist already. That these are innate and inherent in human beings. We are social creatures and we are ready to cooperate and collaborate with each other, given the opportunity. We're just not given the opportunity. So it's not necessarily a hugely radical thing for us to start to adopt these decision-making processes, that we're already socially ready to do that. We're instinctually ready to do that. Then what is required is somebody to set up the forums for these decisions to take place. And in Barcelona, for instance, you had a radical mayor who set up these forums for more participatory decision-making, just as you had in Rojava too. So it seems to me there doesn't need to be that bigger step for these decision-making structures to come about. We can't expect them to happen spontaneously. We do need somebody to set them up. I personally think we could see a lot more of them being set up locally by people spontaneously who would set up a structure and treat it as a decision-making body about local decisions, which would then become a democratic reference point that would in many ways be superior to the existing political structures, because it was participatory, because it was formed by popular consent, because lots of people took part in it and gave it legitimacy in that way. I think you could see a movement emerge of forums of that kind. But as I've said before, I don't necessarily know how these forums might be set up. I mean, they could be set up by a radical mayor, they could be set up by people locally, they could spring from the workplace. The workplace is a place of enormous importance to us in the modern society. Collective decision-making is plausible in those contexts. It's not just, local government necessarily that we're talking about. It's where things that matter take place. So that it could be a hospital, it could be a school, it could be a place. In all of these places, it's not inconceivable to set up collective decision-making that would have legitimacy through participation.
I'm not sure I agree. I mean, human being is something very elastic. It changes following the circumstances. And we are now faced to a generation that is grown up alone, faced to a computer. And I saw my daughter growing. For my generation, it was normal to go out of the house and play with whatever boys or girls were in the court. This was not anymore normal for my daughter's generation. Only one girl, the daughter of an immigrant, started coming home, coming to us, asking my daughter to play. And this was, we were very happy of this, but this was not normal anymore. The normality is the child in the epoch of when it's possible to keep him or her inside the home in front of a television or a computer. And so I'm scared of the lack of social competence of this that this generation may have. And my second objection to the idea, if I did well understand what you say, that we are instinctively prepared to cooperation, is yes, for sure, we cooperate, but I have been in the movement that occupied university against privatization many years ago. And I've partly been in movements that squatted places to make enclosures of a new society, so to say. And what I saw each time is an initial cooperation, initial horizontality, and then the merging of hierarchies. And as if hierarchies were normal in a way, as if those who are more able to speak or more able to network and to act power relationships to emerge. Not necessarily the best, but those are more able at the wrong game in a way.
Yes.
I don't think, yes, cooperation is the most natural thing, but democracy and horizontality need an artificial strive to stay.
Yeah. Well, I think I agree with you about both points. First of all, I think, a more computer literate society, or a society that uses computers much more than we were used to, may have difficulty with face-to-face collaboration. I'm not entirely sure that's true, but there are also ways of designing horizontal decision-making systems that use virtual technologies, that use computers. Taiwan has pioneered the use of computer technology to enable decision-making that is horizontal and participatory, that replicates some of the advantages of face-to-face meeting. I used to think that you could only do truly horizontal decision-making through face-to-face meeting, because only then could you get the qualities of human interaction that compromise requires. But Taiwan has demonstrated that it is possible to design virtual systems that enable successful and legitimate participatory decision-making. As for your second point, I agree. There is always a tendency for hierarchy and power structures to emerge, even in horizontal organizations. I mean, The Tyranny of Structurelessness is a seminal text for me. We saw it at Zuccotti Park. You saw de facto hierarchies emerge of the sort of people who regarded themselves as more pure than others, and who stayed overnight in the square, and they started to assert authority in 100 subtle little ways over everybody else. And it wasn't great to see. I mean, truly horizontal, equalitarian democracy is very hard. It's a process. It requires constant work. I mean, no anarchist should pretend that it's easy. It requires systems. It requires habits. It requires constant vigilance and the awareness of imperfection. So when I say that our tendency to collaborate is instinctual, I mean that it's initial, and it's there. We want to cooperate with each other. We are social beings. We exist because of each other. We really only exist in our relationships with others. And that fundamental social characteristic to me offers great optimism. But the way in which you do it, the structures in which you do it, require work, constant attention, constant maintenance.
Right.
I have
Pointing out that the structures of hierarchy and violence are also require a lot of work. They naturally dissolve in some sense. People don't, like for a state to have an army, they have to train those people over and over again in a rote manner about how to kill people, because normally people just don't like to kill people. Come to conflict, they stop. They just don't do it. So it's easy for somebody far away to order a war, but the people on the front have to train. So in some sense, like there's always there's a prefigurative politics that changing anything in any direction requires people to have some type of experience or image that they're working towards. And even then, at some level, it's going to be just what people do. Do they come together and work together? Or do they come together and not successfully work together? So.
I was thinking of that, of the experience of how younger generation may or may not have the experience of coming together, this social, being social. And I thought about how, what Simona said about the occupation of the university. And in this moment, the level of intensity, how big that is. And we talked last week at the Museum of Care about the Paris Commune. And I was thinking how easy it is in these moments of high tension to build something with walls, to kind of have this inside, outside, us, them, and I think maybe this new generation, we live in urban space, at least, in like me in London, being part of such a movement, I like to know that I can also go out of it. There needs to be an exit. That doesn't, like, I don't want to be in Rojava. I don't know how it's like for people. Can they leave Rojava? Is there this idea of confinement is a bit not in line with democracy as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the potential for stifling autonomy. I mean, anarchists believe in autonomy. They believe in the right of true self-expression. And I think, there's some anarchist thinkers who are skeptical that can ever happen in the context of an organized system, that any organized system is going to limit people's autonomy and freedom to decide their own fate. And that instead you should just leave people to organize and negotiate these things completely autonomously. I personally don't believe that. I believe that some minimal level of organization is necessary to organize society, particularly the sophisticated society we have and sophisticated economy we have today. I think there is a necessity of forums and rulemaking, but those forums and rulemaking should be genuinely participatory and should allow people to express themselves as they wish, fully as they wish. That is very hard to design, and it's very hard to fulfill. But I think with the right cultural circumstances and habits, it's plausible. But I do think a system is necessary. And I accept that any kind of system is going to inhibit people's freedom to some extent. And I think that's a necessary price to pay.
You're muted.
So I just want to say that we spoke for an hour, so maybe if people want to ask the last question, and then we wrap up the interview. Thank you so much for coming.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Somebody want to ask something? No? Okay.
So I'll throw one out. Just like in small scale politics, we talk about how difficult, like Simona has raised, about how difficult it is to build communities and these. We often have an ideal that, like, we say, oh, well, that's not perfect and all these things. I do think it's important to, to compare, ideals are great to shoot for, but sometimes you have something that's better than what was, and it's not always good to shoot down at the attempts to get of an ideal. But one of the things that people really have, and I think certainly David Graeber has written on the idea of prefigurative politics, where you do an event where it's a small moment where people come together and try to form these and think about it. Even if they're not quite successful, it opens up the imagination. On the level of international politics, or I don't know what you would say if it's not international between nations, it's between cultures, or between regions, between small non-state actors and state actors, but on those big scales, are there moments that you think are prefigurative moments of democracy, that of diplomacy, like a moment where what would it take to build at a larger scale prefigurative event or scale or grouping or action within the system of peoples, non-state actors, and international states that would help people think about peaceful futures?
That's a really good question. I mean, almost by definition, the kind of ideal prefigurative action would require mass participation, between countries, between nations, between people, something like that. At the level of diplomacy, you're always talking about an elite activity that involves very small groups of people who are not truly representative. But at that level, I have seen events which have that prefigurative quality. Independent Diplomat used to organize, still does organize, meetings between Security Council diplomats and representatives of non-state groups in person, where there is a quality of interaction that I had not seen elsewhere in diplomacy, because you were putting people together in the same room in person, people who wouldn't normally be together, the leaders of democratic parties or armed groups from conflicts, with the actual diplomats arbitrating those conflicts. It was a very powerful occasion of true human interaction. And so these moments are not impossible, even within the very circumscribed world of diplomacy. But by definition, I think a truly participatory politics would require the abolition of diplomacy. You know, it would require the abolition of the idea of small groups of people arbitrating the affairs of large numbers of people. You know, it would have to be more participatory, even if you had representatives who were accountable and recallable in the way that I described earlier.
Amazing. So on that very radical note of abolition of democracy, of diplomacy, yeah, let's finish our interview and hope for democracy. So we will see this amazing future that you're so optimistic about.
Thanks very much, Carne.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks. Nice to meet you all.
Thank you so much.